Right now, the way you're sitting is something no human on Earth did for over 300,000 years. Not one single ancestor of yours ate a meal the way you eat yours. Not one of them sat in a chair, at a table, with their back straight and their feet on the floor like it's normal. Because it isn't normal. It's actually one of the newest things a human body has ever been asked to do, and your spine, your hips, your knees, they're still not built for it. So what did they do instead? How did billions of people across thousands of generations manage to eat, rest, talk, and live without a single chair? And here's the part that really gets me. This isn't some small, forgotten detail buried in a dusty textbook. This is a clue hiding in plain sight, written directly into your own body, your own hips, your own spine. Right now, whether you've ever noticed it or not. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it changes how you look at something as simple as sitting down for dinner. That's what we're digging into today. And by the end of this, you're going to look at your dining table completely differently. Let's get into it. For almost the entire story of our species, there was no such thing as sitting down at a table. There was no dinner chair, no bench, no stool by the fire. If you go back far enough, past the Romans, past the Egyptians, past the first cities and the first farms, you land in a world where every single human being who ever lived ate their food either standing, crouching, or dropping down into a deep squat with their heels flat on the ground. That position, the deep squat, wasn't a stretch. It wasn't yoga. It was just resting. It was the default. Anthropologists have a name for it now. They call it the resting squat, or the third world squat, because in a lot of places around the world, people still do it every single day without thinking twice. Picture someone waiting for a bus in rural India, or a farmer in the Andes taking a break in the middle of a field, or a herder in East Africa watching his animals. They don't lean on a wall. They don't sit on the ground with their legs out in front of them. They drop straight down into a full squat, heels flat, knees bent all the way, and they just stay there, comfortably, for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. Try that right now if you want. Most people who grew up using chairs their whole life can't hold that position for more than 30 seconds before their heels pop up off the ground, or their lower back starts screaming. And that right there is the mystery. If this position was the natural resting state of the human body for hundreds of thousands of years, why can most people alive today barely do it at all? Something happened. Somewhere between the caves and the kitchen table, the human body changed how it rests, how it eats, and how it moves. And it wasn't because chairs are more comfortable. It wasn't because sitting at a table is somehow better for digestion or better for your bones. It was something else entirely. Something tied to power, to control, to who got to rest easy and who didn't. But before we get to that, we need to understand just how strange the chair actually is when you look at it through the lens of human history. Think about how long humans have existed as a species capable of complex thought, tool use, fire, language, all of it. Most researchers put that number somewhere around 300,000 years, maybe longer. Now, think about how long chairs, the kind you sit in every day, have existed as something an average person, not a king, not a priest, not someone rich, but an average person would actually use in their home. That number is closer to 200 years. Maybe 300 if you're generous. Do the math on that. If you shrunk the entire history of modern humans down into a single 24-hour day, chairs for regular people wouldn't show up until the last 2 seconds before midnight. Everything else, every meal, every fire, every conversation, every birth, every death, all of it happened with people crouched on the ground, squatting by the fire, or sitting flat on a mat. So here's the real question hiding underneath all of this. If squatting and floor sitting worked fine for 300,000 years, why did we replace it? And more importantly, what did we lose when we did? Let's start with the body itself, because this is where things get interesting fast. Our hips are built with an incredible range of motion. Go look at a toddler sometime. Watch how a 2-year-old picks something up off the floor. They don't bend at the waist like an adult does. They drop straight down into a full squat, heels flat, back straight, and they pick the object up like it's nothing. Every toddler on Earth can do this naturally, without training, without stretching, without ever being taught. That's not a coincidence. That's your body's factory setting. Somewhere along the way, most people in industrialized countries lose that ability. Ask most adults who grew up sitting in chairs their whole life to do the same thing the toddler just did, and watch what happens. Their heels lift off the ground, their back rounds forward, their knees complain. Some people can't get low at all without tipping backward. What happened between being 2 years old and being an adult? The answer is simple, and it's a little unsettling once you actually sit with it. Chairs happened. Years and years of sitting with your hips bent at 90 degrees, your legs hanging down, your ankles never asked to stretch, slowly rewired what your body considers normal. The deep squat didn't disappear because it was bad for us. It disappeared because we stopped practicing it. Physical therapists actually see this play out all the time. Give a young child a toy on the floor and they'll drop straight into that same deep squat every time, without thinking about it, without being shown how. It's automatic. The same way grabbing something with your hand is automatic. Nobody teaches a baby how to squat. But somewhere around the age kids start spending long stretches of the day in high chairs, then school chairs, then car seats, that automatic movement starts fading. By the time most people reach their 20s in a chair-heavy culture, the deep squat feels like some kind of advanced stretch, something you'd see in a yoga class instead of what it actually is. A basic human movement that got trained out of us by furniture. This is where the archaeology gets really fascinating because you can actually see this shift written into human bones. There's a specific mark that shows up on the leg bones, mainly on the tibia and the talus, in ancient skeletons. It's sometimes called a squatting facet. It's a small extra surface that forms on the bone from years and years of deep squatting. When archaeologists find skeletons from hunter-gatherer societies, from early farming communities, from countless ancient cultures around the world, that facet shows up again and again. It's like a fingerprint left behind by a lifestyle built around the ground, not around furniture. And then, in populations that adopted chairs early, that facet starts to disappear from the skeletal record. You can actually trace, bone by bone, grave by grave, the moment a culture stopped resting on the ground and started resting on something raised off it. That's wild if you think about it. Your resting position, something so simple, something you don't even think about, is literally written into your skeleton. Archaeologists can look at a 2,000-year-old leg bone and get a decent guess about whether that person spent their life squatting or sitting. And it's not just one dig site, one culture, one lucky find. This same squatting facet has turned up in skeletons from ancient sites in East Asia, from burial grounds in North Africa, from remains found across parts of Europe long before chairs were common there, and from populations in the Americas going back thousands of years. Different continents, different climates, different diets, different tools, different languages that have been dead for centuries. And yet the bones tell the same story over and over again. Humans everywhere rested the same way, long before any of these groups ever had contact with each other. Nobody taught anybody else to squat. It wasn't a trend that spread from one culture to the next. It was just what a human body naturally does when nothing artificial gets in the way. That's the kind of evidence that stops being a coincidence. When completely separate groups of people, oceans apart with no shared history, all end up resting the exact same way, it tells you that behavior wasn't cultural, it was built in. It came from the body itself, not from tradition or fashion or what the neighbors were doing. Now let's talk about why the squat was so effective in the first place, because this isn't just a cultural quirk. There's real biology behind it. Researchers who study modern hunter-gatherer groups, people whose lifestyle is closest to what our ancestors lived, have found something surprising. These groups aren't constantly moving. In fact, studies on groups like the Hadza in Tanzania show that they spend almost as many hours a day being physically inactive as people in industrialized countries do. The difference isn't how much they rest, it's how they rest. A researcher named David Reichlin ran a study on this exact question. His team put movement sensors and muscle activity sensors on Hadza community members and tracked them through entire days. What they found was that even during a rest, when the Hadza dropped into a squat or knelt down, their leg muscles stayed switched on. Low-level, quiet activity, but activity all the same. Their muscles were working even while they thought they were resting. Compare that to sitting in a chair. When you sit in a chair, your leg muscles basically go to sleep, fully relaxed. Zero demand. Your body gets the message that it's time to shut those muscles down completely. Your quads stop firing. Your calves go quiet. Your hip muscles, the ones responsible for keeping your pelvis stable when you walk, get a long break they never used to get, hour after hour, day after day. That tiny difference, muscles staying lightly active during rest instead of switching off completely, might actually matter a lot for long-term health. Constant complete inactivity, hour after hour, day after day, has been linked to all kinds of problems. Heart disease, diabetes, poor circulation, muscle loss. The kind of low-grade muscle activity that squatting and kneeling create might be one of the reasons ancient humans, despite resting plenty, didn't develop the same modern diseases tied to prolonged chair sitting. In other words, the way our ancestors rested might have been protecting them the entire time, and none of them ever knew it. And the Hadza aren't the only group researchers have looked at. Similar patterns show up in studies on groups in the Kalahari Desert, among communities in parts of South America, and among older adults in Japan and parts of India where floor sitting and squatting are still part of everyday life, especially around meals. Over and over, researchers keep finding the same thing. Populations that never fully switched to chair-based living tend to keep strong, flexible hips well into their 70s and 80s. Deep squatting, something a lot of older adults in industrialized countries can barely manage anymore, is often still completely normal for elderly people in these communities. They get up off the ground the same way a small child does. Straight down and straight back up, no hands needed, no furniture required. Compare that to what a lot of doctors and physical therapists in the West see every day. Older adults who struggle to get up from a low couch, people who need to hold onto a countertop just to stand up from the floor. Hip replacements becoming almost expected as people age. Some of that comes down to genetics and general health, sure. But a growing number of researchers now think a huge piece of it comes down to something much simpler. Decades of sitting in chairs slowly took away a range of motion the human hip was built to use every single day. Now, let's step back and look at how eating specifically fit into all of this, because the question we started with wasn't really about resting in general. It was about meals. Why didn't ancient humans sit down at a table to eat? The answer starts with the fact that tables, as objects, needed a few things to exist that early humans simply didn't have. A table needs a fixed home. You don't build furniture if you're moving camp every few weeks following animal herds or fresh water. A table also needs surplus. Somebody has to have enough free time and enough spare wood or stone to build something whose entire purpose is holding food up off the ground. For most of human history, neither of those conditions existed. Early humans ate where the food was, around the fire, near the kill site, wherever the group happened to be gathered when it was time to eat. Meals were social moments, sure, but they weren't formal moments. Nobody was pulling out a chair for anybody. People squatted near the flames, or sat flat on animal hides, or simply stood while tearing into whatever had been cooked that day. Even after humans figured out farming, even after the first villages and towns popped up, chairs still weren't part of daily life for regular people. Archaeological digs from early farming settlements across the Middle East, from places tied to the very first agricultural societies, show almost no evidence of chairs in ordinary homes. What they do show is mats, woven reeds, packed dirt floors that were swept and maintained. People sat, ate, worked, and slept close to the ground, inside homes that had no furniture in the way we think of it today. So if regular people weren't using chairs, who was? This is where the story takes a turn, and honestly, it's the part that changes how you look at every chair you've ever sat in. Chairs, actual raised seats, existed thousands of years before regular people ever used them. But they weren't built for comfort. They were built for power. Go look at ancient Egypt. In Egyptian art, in tomb paintings, in carved reliefs going back over 4,000 years, you'll see a very clear pattern. Pharaohs sit on elevated thrones. Nobles sometimes get stools. Everyone else, servants, farmers, workers, ordinary families, sit on the ground, or crouch nearby. The higher up the social ladder someone was, the higher up off the ground their body was allowed to be. This wasn't an accident of furniture design, it was a message built right into the architecture of daily life. Being raised above the ground meant something. It meant you didn't have to lower yourself literally in front of anyone. Sitting on the ground, on the other hand, meant you were physically beneath someone, beneath their gaze, beneath their authority. Some of the most famous objects ever pulled out of the ground come from exactly this idea. The golden throne found inside the tomb of a young Egyptian king is covered in carvings, gold leaf, and detailed scenes showing him seated while others stand or kneel nearby. That throne wasn't made for comfort during a long meal. It was made to be looked at. It was a statement in solid wood and gold, telling anyone who saw it exactly who held the power in that room and who didn't. Go look at ancient Mesopotamia and you'll find the exact same pattern. Kings on thrones, everyone else on mats, benches at best, or bare ground. Look at ancient China, where certain formal seats were reserved for rulers and officials for centuries. While most of the population sat and ate on floor mats, a tradition that stuck around in parts of East Asia for an incredibly long time, long after chairs became common elsewhere. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, cultures that we tend to picture surrounded by furniture because of movies and paintings, actual daily eating for most people happened reclining on low couches or sitting on simple stools close to the ground. True chairs with backs, the kind built for one specific important person, were often reserved for figures of authority. There's a reason the word chairman still exists today. Literally the man in the chair, the person in charge, the one person in the room allowed to be raised above everyone else. Once you notice that pattern, you can't unsee it. Thrones, judges' benches, the head of the table, teachers standing while students sit on the floor in old classrooms, executives with the big chair behind the big desk while visitors get the small chair on the other side. Chairs were never really about comfort. They were about status, about marking in a very physical, very visible way who had power and who didn't. So if chairs were symbols of power for thousands of years, when did they finally become something an ordinary family would have in their kitchen? That shift really only picks up speed a few hundred years ago, and it's tied directly to two things: cities and factories. As populations packed into growing towns and cities across Europe during the last several centuries, homes got smaller. But wealth, at least for a growing middle class, slowly started to grow too. Furniture making became more efficient. Wood could be cut, shaped, and assembled faster and cheaper than ever before. Chairs stopped being a rare symbol, carved specifically for someone important, and started becoming just another object a household could afford to own. Then the Industrial Revolution hit, and everything sped up even more. Factories needed workers who could sit for long shifts operating machines. Offices needed clerks who could sit for hours copying documents and managing paperwork. Schools needed rows of children who could sit still at desks for structured lessons. An entire new way of living, built around sitting for extended periods, spread across the world in just a couple of centuries. A blink of an eye compared to the 300,000 years that came before it. Think about what a school classroom actually asks a 5-year-old to do. Sit still, in a chair, at a desk, for hours at a time, with a short break here and there. That same 5-year-old, just a couple generations earlier, or in a community that never adopted chair-based living, would have spent that same stretch of time squatting by a fire, kneeling while helping prepare food, or moving around a village doing small tasks close to the ground. Nobody sat still like that. Nobody had to. Now it's considered a basic requirement of childhood almost everywhere on the planet, and most of us never stop to ask when that became normal, or whether it actually is. Even the dinner table itself, the exact thing this whole video started with, only became a fixture in ordinary homes fairly recently. Go back a few hundred years in most parts of the world, and a shared family meal at a raised table with individual chairs for every person simply wasn't how households worked. Families ate close together on mats, around a low table barely off the ground, or straight from a shared pot set near the fire. The picture we now think of as a completely standard, timeless family dinner, everyone up in chairs around a tall table, is actually a fairly modern habit dressed up to look ancient. And here's the part that should make you pause. Our bodies never got the memo that any of this was happening. Evolution doesn't work on a timeline of centuries. It works on a timeline of tens of thousands of years, sometimes more. The human hip, spine, and leg muscles that were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of squatting, kneeling, walking, and resting close to the ground got dropped into an entirely new lifestyle almost overnight, at least by evolutionary standards. Sitting in chairs for 8, 10, 12 hours a day is something no human body was ever actually designed to handle. This is the climax of the whole story, the moment where everything we've talked about collides. For 300,000 years, the human body developed and adapted around movement, around squatting, kneeling, and resting close to the earth. Then, in a tiny sliver of time, practically the last few seconds of that 24-hour clock we talked about earlier, we invented a completely new way of resting, a way that requires almost none of the muscle engagement our bodies are used to, a way that locks the hips into a single fixed angle for hours at a time, a way that, for most of human history, was reserved only for the most powerful person in the room. And now, billions of us do it every single day for most of our waking lives without ever questioning it. Modern research has started catching up to what our bones already knew. Long hours of chair sitting have been linked again and again to lower back pain, tight and weakened hip muscles, poor posture, and even long-term issues with blood sugar and heart health. Some researchers have gone as far as calling prolonged sitting one of the biggest hidden health risks of modern life, right up there with poor diet and lack of exercise. Meanwhile, populations that still spend large parts of their day squatting or sitting on the floor, doing chores, eating meals, resting with friends, tend to show better hip mobility and fewer of these specific problems well into old age. Think about that. The position our ancestors used for hundreds of thousands of years, the one modern life nearly erased, might actually be one of the healthiest ways for a human body to rest. And the position we replaced it with, the one we now consider completely normal, might be quietly working against us the entire time. Doctors and physical therapists today talk about something called hip flexor tightness almost constantly, and it lines up perfectly with everything we've covered so far. Sit with your hips bent for 8 or 10 hours a day after day, year after year, and the muscles at the front of your hip slowly shorten and stiffen. That tightness doesn't stay in your hip either. It pulls on your lower back, changes how you stand, changes how you walk, and for a lot of people, it's the quiet root cause behind years of unexplained back pain that no amount of stretching seems to fully fix. Meanwhile, a body that regularly moves through a full squat, hips bent all the way, then hips fully open again while standing, never gives those muscles the chance to lock up in the first place. The joint simply keeps doing what it was built to do. There's also something worth mentioning about digestion, since this whole video started with the question of eating specifically. Some researchers and doctors have pointed out that sitting in a deep squat, or even simply sitting cross-legged on the floor, naturally puts the body in a position that can support easier digestion after a meal, compared to sitting upright in a chair with the stomach slightly compressed. It's a smaller piece of the puzzle compared to the bigger hip and spine story, but it's one more small sign that the floor-based eating habits of our ancestors weren't some primitive inconvenience. They may have simply been working with the body instead of against it. There's something almost poetic about it. The chair, something invented to lift certain people above everyone else, ended up spreading to nearly the entire world. But in gaining that height, in gaining that comfort and status, we may have lost something our bodies never stopped needing. Real movement, real engagement, a connection to the ground that shaped us for 300,000 years before anyone ever thought to build something to sit on. So back to the question we started with. Why didn't ancient humans sit down at a table to eat? The truth is, they didn't need to. Their bodies were already built for something else. Squatting by the fire, kneeling on a mat, resting close to the earth in a position that kept their muscles quietly working even while they relaxed. Tables and chairs weren't an upgrade for them. They weren't even on the radar. Furniture like that only started to matter once humans built societies with hierarchies, where being raised above the ground became a way to show who was in charge. And somewhere along that long, strange road, from cave fires to farming villages to royal thrones to factory floors to your kitchen table, the deep squat, the position that carried our ancestors through 300,000 years of history, quietly disappeared from most of our lives. It's still in your body, though. It's still in your hips, your ankles, your spine, waiting. Most people just haven't asked their body to do it in years. What's strange is how invisible this whole shift has been. Nobody sat down one day and announced that squatting was over and chairs were the future. It happened slowly, quietly, over generations, spreading through cities, factories, schools, and homes until it just became the water we swim in. Something so normal that questioning it feels a little silly. But that's exactly why it's worth questioning. The most powerful habits are usually the ones nobody ever thinks to ask about, simply because they've never known anything else. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not that chairs are evil or that everyone needs to throw out their furniture and start eating on the floor tonight. It's simpler than that. It's just a reminder that a lot of what feels completely normal in daily life is actually incredibly new when you measure it against the full length of human history. Your body carries an old story inside it, one written over hundreds of thousands of years, long before anyone ever thought to build something to sit on. Next time you sit down to eat, maybe think about that for a second, about how new that chair really is, about how much older, and honestly, how much smarter that old squat might have been. If you want to see what ancient humans actually slept on before beds ever existed, the next video breaks down exactly that.